What's the hardest lesson you ever had to learn?
Soul teachers.
Conversations that reach deep into the soul.
We provide a place for our guests to tell stories that seek the sacred, allow space for transformation.
Create a tolerant community.
It's
Soul
Soul
Teacher.
Teachers.
So I'm talking with Paul Colwell here on Vashon Island. He's one of the founders of Up With People. He and his brothers helped produce shows in 6 continents, playing for athletes in Munich after the terrorist attack in 1972, in a bull ring in Madrid, in Watts, Carnegie Hall, and at 6 Super Bowl halftimes. The Beachcomber covered all that. You realize that, Paul?
Well, they got the half times. It was only 4.
Yeah, I mean, that's a straight quote from the Beachcomber. Oh, it's
I know,
4. You're saying it's 4
It's
Super
4
Bowl
so
halftimes.
4 Super Bowl half times. Yeah, but
Well,
that's fine. 6.
Still pretty good.
It felt like 6.
Yeah. You've had, by all accounts, Paul, an incredibly meaningful life, and we're incredibly honored that you're here with us today in the studio. Thank you.
Well, thank you
And
for.
welcome.
I'm honored to be here, and it's always a privilege working with you, Stephen, here at the high school.
Thank you. Thank you. So you're a musician. I think every conversation I've had with you, and I think we've had a few, we end up talking about music or writing, art, I guess. So I'm just curious, how would you describe your own musical style?
Well, my musical style is very. I'm untrained essentially. My brothers and I started out playing country, western, bluegrass music when we were kids. And our style is really more folk, country, bluegrass. But, when we traveled the world, we had to incorporate, ethnic music from a lot of different places, or we tried to. So it was then it became kind of a fusion of our folk country style with the different kinds of music from all over the world.
Yeah, that's a really nice description, because when I think of you, I think of somebody who's probably one of the best listeners I've ever seen. You connect with almost anyone. And I think that fusion of music is also sort of a fusion of the way that you interact with people as well. I want to talk actually a bit about how the group was started. My understanding is it was started by you and your brothers, Ralph, Paul, you're Paul, and Steve and Herb Allen. You co-founded the group in 1965 with Jay Blanton Belk, and you play a number of instruments. Can you talk about how many instruments you play?
Essentially guitar, banjo, and mandolin. Our beginnings in music, really what gave us a foundation, was piano lessons when we were little kids.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's when we started to pick up our string instruments. We had a good start on kind of a basic understanding of music.
So
Yeah.
who made you take piano lessons?
My mother and mother, maybe dad too. I don't. They didn't make us so much as encouraged us to do it, and that lasted for a couple of years. We didn't last too long, but it was enough to get us started.
It's interesting because
Yeah.
I first began singing with my 3 older sisters. We
You did?
sang. I
Wow.
sang as a trio.
Yeah.
I sang as a quartet.
Wow.
When I was in high school, I
Yeah.
sang in a men's quartet. It
Huh.
wasn't barbershop, but it
Yeah.
was a very close
Yeah.
cousin. And we also, we didn't have near the experience you had, but we even produced a couple of albums, which leads me to my next question.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea how many albums Up With People has actually produced?
Just to explain, my brothers and I were creators of kind of musical founders of Up With People. But the organization, which in 1968 incorporated as a non-sectarian, non-political educational program, was, so 68 is when we really formally organized. It was beginning to take shape in 65. We kind of say 65.
Right.
But in 65, there was a bunch of us who had traveled together around the world doing a lot of conciliation work with an organization called Moral Rearmament.
Oh, yes.
And we decided it was time to really do something else and to start something that maybe would be of an educational, global leadership nature. So that's when we started Up with People. But our international experience, the years leading up to 65, and I'm not answering a question, but kind of little history, gave us, I think, really gave us the ability to start this organization, because we, prior to beginning of Up with People in '68, we had traveled, worked, as you said, 6 continents,
Right.
played for presidents and kings in villages, and played everywhere. We were all over the world, and that gave us a feel of the world. And so in terms of albums, our first album in '65, we had I'd say probably 20 over, and they're still being produced.
Are they really?
Oh yeah, it's still going, and I'm still working on a consultancy basis with Up with People.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm going to ask you another question. That is, you said that you decided to make it an educational. Why education? Because it appears to me that you've been drawn to education in a variety of ways across your life. Why did you decide to make this an educational rather than just a performance?
Well, I think it's because it was educational. The performance was educational. The prototype became our model from '68 on. We had 130 young people from many different countries, and they weren't all professionals. They weren't all talented, and we didn't recruit for talent. We recruited more for motivation, what people wanted to do to make a difference in the world. In the process, we got talent, but the experience of staging and performing and traveling and living in homes, and that's an education. And so we decided also to give it legitimacy, because it was more than a show. And if we just kind of limited it to a performance, it wouldn't quite have the same importance.
I was really drawn toward this in part because I talk with my students about servant leadership and how important it is that a leader be first and foremost a servant, serving the people he leads, or she or they.
Right.
And so when I hear you talk about, and I've read this in the research as well, is that you saw this organization as a way to allow students to become, or allow people to become leaders, young people to become leaders. How has that worked out? Have you seen people go from Up with People to become national leaders, or what have you observed?
Yes, we have. Alumni of Up with People have gone into all different walks of life, into medicine, into politics. I think we haven't yet seen the full impact of those who might go into public life. I mean, there's someone like Betsy Myers, who was one of the assistants of Barack Obama. So she's written a book on leadership. And, we've had sports director for NBC was an alum. But a lot of people have also gone into a lot of charitable work in the world. So anyway, we've seen them in terms of leadership and service. You mentioned service. I think that is, most of them come out of this experience with a real sense of service.
I'm curious if you can remember the moment you decided to create Up with People. I'm curious if you can remember, the conversations you must have had. I mean, imagine we're a fly on the wall, watching and listening. What would we have heard?
Well, I'll kind of jump ahead, because it really started in a very simple way. There was a conference under the auspices of MRA, which was what we were doing prior to officially breaking away and starting Up with People, a youth conference. And young people were going to come from all over the country. And there was a discussion amongst our colleagues and ourselves, and a lot of youth leaders who came in for this to discuss, okay, what are we going to do at this conference? And we decided, well, one thing we would do musically would be to do a kind of a little coffee shop type thing, or coffee house, not coffee shop, coffee house type thing. You know, this
They
was
used to have those, didn't
Peter,
they?
Paul, and Mary, and you know, the sort of the folk type thing, Joan Baez, and this,
Yeah.
and we would do kind of a very informal musical evening every once a week, and so that's kind of was our. We sort of say, okay, we'll do that. That's what we're going to do for this conference. That would be the musical element. And what happened was so many people sort of jumped into the mix with a lot of talent. It ended up to be a big variety show with lights and sound, and it was just a big show. And it never was a coffee house thing. It just became a big production. And the second,
That's great.
the second week, there were some people from Asia were there, and some congressmen from Washington, and people were there, and they say, "Hey, you guys got to take this show on the road." And that was this was not what we had intended. And so that's kind of how it. That was the conversation. Was, well, what are we going to do for this conference?
I wanted to ask one more question before we take a break.
Yeah.
And that is, I know you said that your family was not overly religious, and but I'm fascinated by your openness in talking about spirituality, the Lord, God. I mean, I hear it I heard it on so many of the songs that I was listening to as I was sort of listening to some of your albums. Clearly, at the very least, you're comfortable with your spirituality, and yet I think you made the very clear decision to reject the idea of calling the group Christian. I think you've kind of answered this by now, but I'd love to hear you say why.
Well, I think the song that you hear of the Lord and God is "What Color Is God's Skin?"
Mm-hmm.
And other than that, you know, some of the songs that perhaps, I mean, I have to think back. Anyway, so in 1965, we were kind of working under those auspices of MRA, and it was a quasi-religious organization, but very ecumenical. We had people from all religions. We had Buddhists and Hindus, and Raj Mohan Gandhi was the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, who's been here actually to Vashon to visit us here. We worked with him in India, and so it had a spiritual base, foundation way back, but it was a very ecumenical and open even to people without any religious affiliation. But I think the feeling was when we got up with people started to grow, more and more people wanted to be involved. We decided it would just be more inclusive to it without taking the spirit out of it, because you can, you know, I mean, it was two things. One is to have the spirit of humanity, the spirit of our common humanity in there, but it would be more inclusive, and you have much more involvement to become non-sectarian.
Sure.
And it was a definite decision. So that was the reason in '68 we decided it's a different thing than moral rearmament, but it was our experiences in the world as we traveled with that group doing conciliation work that kind of gave us the background and the knowledge of the world to allow us to start up with people.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience was in part the same way, believing that I wanted to be able to do more than live within a small Christian community. I wanted to be able to reach out to the world and live within the world rather than apart from the world. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll be asking Paul about the woman he fell in love with and one of the songs he considers almost as important to their sound as the song Up With People. Are you looking to sell your house? You can't do better than Windermere on Vashon, and in particular, Mary Margaret Briggs, realtor at Windermere. When my wife and I decided to sell our house, I went straight to Mary Margaret She supports the arts and education here in our little town. In fact, when my students didn't go to her to buy an ad, she sent me a reminder. As our agent, she has gone over and above. She actually came out and weeded our flower beds during the final rush. Plus, the house was gorgeously staged. So when you sell your house, go with the best. Go with Mary Margaret Briggs and start your next chapter with Windermere. So we're back in the studio here with Paul Colwell, who is one of the founders of Up With People. So in 1976, Up With People began to make frequent appearances at the Super Bowl, and you said that you performed in 4 Super Bowl halftime shows between 1976 and 1988.
86, yeah, 1986.
1986,
yeah,
right. And you performed at the pregame show of Super Bowl 25, I think, in 1991. Is that correct?
Very possibly, yeah. I think you're right.
So you married Catalina Quinn.
I did.
The daughter of Anthony Quinn, the actor, in 1967. Right. How did you meet your wife?
I met her in Switzerland in 1961 at a conference, an international conference in Co, Switzerland. And she was just a young gal coming up from Italy and to this conference. And then over the ensuing years, we traveled together and on various projects in Asia and India. And we talked about Raj Mohan Gandhi in India. She and I were on a big march across the nation there, and we did a tour of Italy in '62. So, you know, we got to know each other. We knew each other. We weren't dating, but we you know, got to know her. And
sounds like a shared sense of mission as well.
Oh, absolutely. We were. There was really hardly any time for anything. We were just going at it, full tilt. Yeah.
So one of the questions that I had as well, it must have been difficult. I know that Up With People had some criticisms of the program, that it had been championing extreme right-wing politics or accusations of being some kind of cult. How did Up With People respond to that sort of criticism?
Well, you know, as an organization, you know, I can only speak for myself.
Sure.
But Up With People is not a cult. Maybe there were some aspects that could have been cult-like in the sense that the demands on us were, we lived a rather, some ways a rather monastic life. You know, we were
sure.
We were totally committed, and I think that the confusion is that when we say Up With People started in '65, it was really under MRA, and some aspects of moral rearmament, and the messages were rather conservative, definitely early on. Certainly supported the Vietnam War and that sort of thing. It was very moralistic, but the idea, and I'll say in defense of that it was not out of step with probably more than half of the country. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So you can look back on it and say, well, it was, but there was a right-wing guy who wanted to get us under his wing, and a guy called Patrick Frawley, and who was the president of Schick I think he has something to do with Schick Shadle, because he, anyway, and we wouldn't. He wanted to really. I don't know what the offer was, but it was some way. We turned down every offer of anybody. It's always been in our control. Yeah. No one has ever controlled us. And no right-wing organization, no left-wing. I remember in '68, we were invited to play at the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention. That was 68 when the Chicago 7.
Sure,
Remember the
sure.
Chicago 7?
Oh, yeah.
So by 68, the organization was very different. It was a different organization, but also just in its, how could I put it? I would say politics, but I'd say very much in sort of the, if you could give it a political, it was non-political, it was not right-wing by any means. Most of us, I think, voted for Humphrey, in 68.
Yeah.
And although we did ride in the inaugural parade of Nixon.
Oh, did you?
We did. So that was probably not a good, but by then we had incorporated as Up With People. Mm-hmm. So the confusion comes from the criticism of MRA. And we weren't really fully Up With People until 68.
Life is complicated. It's
is.
hard to sort of neatly put things in.
But Up With People was by no means a cult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Must have been very difficult for you to hear those accusations as much as you love this organization.
Well, yeah, but I also understand where it comes from.
Uh-huh.
I understand that it's confusing one organization with the other.
Yeah.
And it's very different.
Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
There's a question I'd like to ask you, and we ask it of every guest that we have, and it's this. What's the hardest lesson you ever had to learn in order to become the person that you became? What would be the hardest lesson?
Well, one thing I would say that I'm still becoming. I'm still becoming the person that I'm trying to be. And that's kind of every day. But maybe understanding my weaknesses was probably the hardest. Understanding, I think in marriage, one really has to face oneself. And I think as a entertainer and as a performer, I've had to face the fact that the self-centeredness that is part of that, the desire for what's the motivation, for the applause and that sort of thing. But I've had to really kind of understand that maybe I'm not as good a guy as I like to think I am. Yeah.
I think that's a lesson I probably try to teach my leaders in the youth organizations I go with is, I mean, if you have learned that lesson and have passed it on to people, I think it's really powerful. Thank you. And so I mentioned earlier that I've listened to multiple albums by Up With People, and I know your song Up With People is ubiquitous to the group, but I was fascinated by another piece that seems to be performed again and again in at least the series of albums that I listened to. What Color is God's Skin? In fact, you told me earlier today that it preceded Up With People in terms of being the sound of the group. I'm just curious, why do you think that song is so important to you, and what is a message you take from it in terms of your daily life?
Well, one thing, I can go back to our years in MRA, Moral Rearmament. We were very much involved and very much, in the middle of the civil rights struggle. Mm-hmm. And there were various plays and movies that we did, and in the days of MRA that were part of the, part of that civil rights movement, and the phrase "What color is God's skin?" was some friends of ours heard someone give a speech, and mentioned that, and that came out in a speech someone made in Atlanta or somewhere, and these guys decided to write a song about it. So, and I think it kind of
It evolved, didn't it?
It did, and it struck a chord. It's the way it's kind of from the standpoint of a little kid asking a question, and I think that's what makes it so appealing.
I think the 1970s version I heard, the woman spoke that story, and by the time I got to the 80s, they were singing it as a song, which is what I remember hearing when I was younger.
I mean, it was kind of like just a little folk song that when 1964 is when it was written.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What an incredible impact a song can have. I'm wondering if you'd take us out by playing it for us.
Sure. Sorry. Good night, I said to my little son, so tired out when the day was done. Then he said, as I tucked him in, tell me, Daddy, what color's God's skin? What color is God's skin? What color is God's skin? I said, it's black, brown, it's yellow, it's red, it is white. Everyone's the same in the good Lord's sight. He looked at me with his shining eyes. I knew I could tell no lies when he said, Daddy, why do the different races fight if we're the same in the good Lord's sight? What color is God's skin? What color is God's skin? I said, it's black, brown, it's yellow, it's red, it is white. Everyone's the same in the good Lord's sight. Son, that's part of our suffering past, but the whole human family is learning at last. The thing we missed on the road we trod is walking as the daughters and the sons of God. What color is God's skin? What color is God's skin?
Thanks for joining me on Soul Teachers. This episode was directed by Amy Wagner, produced by Andy Callender, edited by Brandon Fairbanks, and researched by Dr. Eric Bishop. Our theme music, Born, is by Over the Rhine. Our website, www.thesoulteachers.com, was built by Each and Every, a design company in Kent, Ohio. You can find us wherever podcasts are hosted. We hope you'll like us on Facebook at The Soul Teachers. You can follow us on Twitter at teachers_soul. I'm your host, Stephen Denlinger.